in connection with... Right, okay, jolly good. Recording in progress. In the same way, in connection with Xerxes' invasion, the historian himself, Herodotus himself, as narrator, endorses the view that the Athenians were the saviors of Greece, in that once they opted for what he calls freedom, the rest of the Greeks, or at least those who hadn't already Medized, followed. So that's 7.139. If Greek polis had come under this kind of external control, of course, their internal political structures would have been affected as well. And the link that this presupposes between internal and external freedom is most memorably drawn, I think, in the passage here in number 3 on the handout, the famous Despotes Nomos passage from Book 7, in the dialogue between Xerxes and the deposed Spartan king Demaratus. So according to Demaratus, what will make the Spartans resist the slavery that Xerxes is trying to impose upon them is the fact that although they're free, they subject themselves to the law. Their fear of the law, as he puts it, is greater than the fear that Xerxes inspires in his subjects, despite Xerxes' belief that only fear of negative consequences is capable of making men fight. So internally, Greek communities are represented as different from the Persian Empire. A key element of this is that members of Greek communities freely choose their courses of action, by contrast with the sheer obedience of the king's subjects, which has to be coerced, it has to be imposed by force. In Greek communities, claims to respect have to be balanced by the recognition of similar claims on the part of other members of the community. They're all equal before the law. And failure to recognize such claims is liable to sanction, including the sanction of other people's disapproval or disesteem. Part of what makes the difference in this respect is what the Corinthian Socles in Book 5 calls isokratia. So the comparative equality between citizens that's characteristic of most Greek forms of political organization, with the exception of tyranny. But as Demaratus emphasizes, this is also a distinction between Greeks and Persians in terms of international relations. The freedom enjoyed by citizens in Greek states, at least when they're not subject to tyranny, is both in the authorial voice and in character speech linked to the freedom and the independence of Greek states. So Greek states are free of external interference because they're free internally too. And these phenomena raise the issue of honor in a number of ways. First of all, we have relations between the king and his benefactors. In opposition to the construction of Hydarnes, that these relations involve the king's honoring his friends, his Spartan guests argue that this is a type of relationship that demeans the recipient of the king's benefactions. The loss of status that that relationship involves is for them a price that's too high to pay. So it's clearly about self-esteem and esteem. Then we have forms of political organization that demand a degree of respect for one's fellow citizens, as opposed to the supposed Persian model in which subjects are coerced like slaves. And finally, we have claims on the part of Greek states to freedom and independence that rest on these internal distributions of status and esteem, again in contrast to a model that sees the Persian king as a slave master, not only of individual subjects, but also of subject nations and communities. So in all of this, the notion or the metaphor of slavery is being used to highlight extreme inequalities of honor. If the king's own subjects, the subject nations of the Persian Empire, and now at least potentially Greek city-states and their citizens, are just slaves of the Persian king, then it might seem that all of these are being placed in a category in which claims to honor are minimal. Notoriously, this is the definition of slavery of Orlando Patterson. It's a condition without honor. So it might seem that all of these people who are being described as slaves are being placed in a category in which individuals have no honor. But in order to establish the extent to which that's true, and to establish what Herodotus makes of this, we need to pin down precisely what kinds of honor we're dealing with. So, to the basics. When applied to human beings, the word time, the regular Greek word for value or price, has two closely related and mutually implicated senses. It refers to the esteem or the recognition that a person receives from others, but it can also refer to a quality or set of qualities in an individual that attract the esteem or the recognition of others. So it can refer to esteem or recognition conferred by others, but it can also refer to the claim to honor, the value of the individual that is esteemed or recognized by others. So time is both the intrinsic value of the individual and the value placed on the individual by other people. So in economic terms, because this is after all an economic metaphor, time is both value and price. It's what the thing is worth, and it's the value that others are prepared to place on it. Or we could see things in Irving Goffman's terms. So I've given you Goffman there. He's on the bibliography at the end of the handout, number 5 in the handout. In Goffman's scheme in Interaction Ritual, 1967, time, like other terms associated with it, such as eidos and hubris, is bidirectional in that it encompasses both what Goffman calls demeanor, how you present yourself, and what Goffman calls deference, how other people respond to your self-presentation. And in any interaction, according to Goffman, I think rightly, both of those things are in play at all times. So you can't simply present yourself. You can't simply go into an interaction with demeanor, because the other person will be representing their demeanor too. They will be presenting themselves as well. So it's always this give and take between presenting yourself and responding to the other person's self-presentation. So exhibiting both demeanor and deference for the other's demeanor. So it's bidirectional. Insofar as it refers to the claim to respect, time very clearly also encompasses the roles that are bound up with a person's status. So regular senses of the term time, as we show in number 6 on the handout here, are things like prerogative, status, or office. So in Herodotus, for example, the timai, that were the offices of the Athenian state, both expressed the esteem in which the individual was held and constituted a claim to that esteem. These are the timai that, according to Herodotus in Book 1, Pisistratus left undisturbed. It's this sense of time as a claim to honor, as status, as prerogative, or office, or role, that in fact forms the biggest single category of applications of the concept in Herodotus. Time, in this sense, can refer to the prerogatives, the things you're allowed to do that come with membership of a citizen community. So, for example, in Book 4, as the prerogatives of the citizens of Sparta at 4.145, but it's also used of the powers and prerogatives of gods and kings. And so, as you see for Xerxes himself there, the position of king is itself a time. He says, when I took the throne, I began to consider how to avoid falling short of those who preceded me in this time. Becoming king and being in this time mean the same thing. The time of king is a role that demands the respect of others. But as we've seen, the king can be represented as a dispenser as well as a recipient of honor. And though Herodotus repeatedly returns to the idea that the relationship between the king and others amounts to the same thing as the relationship between master and slave, he also equally repeatedly makes it clear that the same relationship between king and subject involves reciprocity of honor. It's the prestigious status of the office of king, this is number 8 on the handout now, that gives the king the power and the capacity to confer honor on trusted retainers, which he often does by giving them special roles and responsibilities. So in Book 3, serving as the wine pourer for Cambyses, described as itself no small time, honors the son in the same way as the role of messenger shows how Cambyses particularly esteemed etima malista, the father. These positions express the king's esteem as a reward for loyalty and services rendered, often expressed as a matter of the subordinate's excellence, their arete, or in terms of being a good man. So aner agathos einai. But these awards of time, these ways in which esteem is shown for services rendered, also confer a prestige that other people should recognize. Being the wine pourer of Cambyses is a role that commands the respect of others as well as being an expression of Cambyses' esteem. At the same time, the very services that the retainers and benefactors perform recognize the king's claim to deference on the basis of his office. So the king honors his retainers and his benefactors, and they honor him in return, and they, as the king's retainers and benefactors, are honored by others. Now, honoring others, honoring benefactors, is normal Greek practice. But as Herodotus assures us, it's also a Persian custom as well. This is number 9 on the handout. So Zopyrus, a Persian nobleman, conceives the idea that Babylon is destined soon to fall to the besieging Persians, and he wants to be the one who's going to bring it about as a way of obtaining the gratitude of the king, as he says, as the narrator says, because among the Persians, benefactions are greatly honored in return in proportion to their magnitude. That's Book 3, chapter 154. To win the trust of the Babylonians, Zopyrus mutilates himself and blames Darius. Then he opens the gates of the city to the attacking Persians and wins Darius's undying esteem, his time, as Persia's greatest benefactor. It's similar also, number 10 on the handout here, in the case of Xerxes' gratitude towards Boges, the governor of Eion and Thrace. Xerxes never stopped praising him, we're told, and he honored his surviving sons because Boges preferred to die in execution of his task as governor, sacrificing himself and his entire household, rather than court the charge of cowardice in the king's eyes by surrendering the city and returning to Asia under a truce. And another paradigmatic instance is the gratitude of Darius towards Siloson, a Greek from Samos. When Darius was just a humble guardsman, he caught sight of Siloson on a visit to Egypt and took a fancy to his cloak. Although he offered to buy it, Siloson gave it to him as a gift. After Darius became king, Siloson seized his opportunity and reminded Darius of his benefaction. As Siloson had given according to his means in the past, so now Darius reciprocates in accordance with his means as king. So the king honors others, subordinates, for their services, and these services indicate their arete, their excellence. The exchange of goods and services can also bind the king and the subject into a relationship that's configured very much in terms of Greek philia. And yet, as we remember, this is a kind of philia that the Greeks can describe as slavery. The interrelation, and maybe we might say the tension between these categories, is brought out especially in another episode in Book 7. This is number 12 on the handout. So as Xerxes and his forces make their way through Phrygia, they're entertained by a rich Lydian called Pythias, who offers to devote all his monetary wealth, which is an immense sum, since Pythias is the second richest man in the world after Xerxes. He offers to devote all this money to financing the expedition. Xerxes won't hear of it, but instead rewards Pythias with the 7,000 gold staters he needs to bring his total up to 4 million, and he makes Pythias his guest friend. I don't think I can get all of this on the one page at the one time, but let's see if you have the handout in front of you, you'll be able to see it. So Pythias is now Xerxes' guest friend. Emboldened by this, Pythias asks Xerxes for one more favor. He asks him to spare the eldest of his 5 sons from participation in the expedition. And Xerxes is then furious at the impudence, the tolma and the anaideia of a slave. But he represents his punishment as a form of generosity. So just as he previously gave a greater reward than he had received as a benefaction, so now that Pythias has disappointed him, he returns less harm. He's only going to kill the son that Pythias had asked him to excuse. So he has his men cut the boy in 2, and then he makes his army march between the 2 halves, one of the 2 halves on either side of the road. So you might think on the face of it that this story, like the story of Hydarnes and the Spartans, is designed to expose the misrecognition, the bourgeoisie and méconnaissance involved in the notion that the king and his benefactors can be philoi or xenoi. So you might say the asymmetry is just too great, and the truth of the matter is exposed. Ultimately, Xerxes regards these people as slaves and not really as friends. And yet, as we've just seen, there are plenty of examples in which the norms of reciprocity are in fact observed. Benefactions are handsomely rewarded and honors are granted. So these cases might suggest, by contrast, that the characterization of the relationship between the king and his subject in terms of master and slave doesn't really apply. But both of those conclusions would in fact be wrong, for the simple reason that in both the literal sense and in the metaphorical sense, masters can honor their slaves. Relations with slaves don't preclude honor and reciprocity. The coexistence of reciprocity of honor and extreme asymmetry of honor can be a feature of real and literal master-slave relations. And so it isn't the case that episodes in which the king honors his subjects undercut the rhetoric or the metaphor of slavery. As Kostas Vlasopoulos has shown in a number of studies, of which I cite only one of the most recent, in number 13, masters could and did honor their slaves for their services and their benefactions. As Vlasopoulos notes, slavery could also be envisaged as an asymmetrical relationship of benefaction and reward. Masters could opt to see slave labor as loyal service and choose to reward deserving slaves with trust, honor, and material benefits. Slaves could see their service as the foundation for claims to just rewards. And so it's important in this connection, I think, to notice that Xerxes doesn't, in fact, simply jettison the notion that Pythias is his guest friend as if it were a fiction or a pretense. Instead, he insists that it's Pythias who's violated their relationship by failing to accord him the respect that is his due. This then legitimizes his retaliation, but even so, he won't, he says, reciprocate as harshly as Pythias if his offense really deserves. Xerxes saw Pythias' original offer as a challenge. The original generosity would have put Xerxes in Pythias' debt. Instead, he creates a debt in the other direction, so that Pythias owes him more than he owes Pythias. When Pythias then responds not with deference, but with alleged disrespect, Xerxes again retains the upper hand. Pythias is still in his debt in that his loss is less than Xerxes, as Xerxes represents it. Xerxes represents himself as being magnanimous in returning harm, just as he was previously magnanimous in returning benefit. And this is a way of retaining the relationship of reciprocity, even as the description of that relationship in terms of slavery highlights its asymmetry. In behaving in this way, Xerxes may be responding to the pull of what Herodotus tells us are Persian norms in the conduct of actual master-slave relations. That's number 14 on the handout. Not even the king, we're told, can execute a person for a single crime, or a master impose any irremediable punishment on a slave for a single offense. Only after calculation, logismos, that the slave's adikemata outweigh his services, should the master express his anger, his thumos. So there's a presupposition here that the slave would have grounds for complaint if these norms were violated. If the slave had grounds for complaint, that would mean that the slave did not deserve such treatment and was entitled to better treatment. By the same token, if these norms are widely observed, then the master will forfeit esteem by failing to abide by them. Whether we're imaginatively trying to put ourselves in the place of Herodotus's original Greek readers, or simply responding in our own persons to the story of Pythias, I think we're appalled at what is a travesty and perversion of the norms of reciprocity. According to Herodotus, number 15 on the handout, there are ways of requiting even genuine insults that are excessive and illegitimate, as we see in the case of Pheretime. But it's still important that Xerxes doesn't simply shrug off these norms. Instead, he justifies his conduct in the light of the norms. He represents his insane sensitivity to insult and the extremity of his retaliation as entirely consonant with the norms of reciprocity. Indeed, he represents them as manifesting supererogatory forms of magnanimity. And this is a tactic he deploys also in justifying what Herodotus represents as his attempt to enslave the Greeks. So we're at number 16, Xerxes' invasion. So this attempt to enslave the Greeks, as represented by Herodotus, is driven by Xerxes' concern for his own time. As we saw, Xerxes sees his position of king in itself as a time. It's a role or an office. But since his predecessors in that role increased the empire, the onus is on him to pursue further glory, kudos. At the same time, he also wants to recover the time that was lost when his father Darius was defeated by the Athenians at Marathon, obtaining redress, timoria, and tissis from those who took the initiative in unjust aggression, as he describes it. So Xerxes insists on royal time as a claim to respect. He regards that claim as having been illegitimately violated, and he justifies retaliation in that light. But his motives are also mixed. They're mixed not just in the sense that the claim of justified retaliation coexists with expansionist motives in material terms and in terms of time. He sees an imperative to maintain and enhance the esteem in which his office is held, as well as to defend what he sees as his legitimate claims. But insofar as he represents the expedition as a legitimate response to gratuitous harm, he's making a move that's typical of the rhetoric of Herodotean belligerence. And this, of course, is also a key issue for the historian himself, as we see from the very beginning of the histories in the search for the original act of unprovoked aggression, unjust deeds, that lies behind the enmity of Greek and barbarian. This is number 17 on the handout, the question of who started it. So this issue of who started it is, in Greek terms and in Herodotean terms, about right and wrong. about justice and injustice. This is a notion of justice that depends on strict notions of reciprocity. Injustice in this scheme is what Marshall Zalins calls negative reciprocity. In this case, initiating harm rather than doing what reciprocity and justice require, and offering harm only in requital for harm received. So harming the other person first is what Salins calls negative reciprocity. Xerxes justifies his invasion as retaliation for dishonor suffered. But this is also to acknowledge that without such a justification, the invasion itself would be an act of gratuitous harm or negative reciprocity. It would be illegitimate as an attack on the honor of free and independent states. Even if Xerxes and the Persians regard other peoples as potential slaves, there for the taking, they are at least partially conscious of ethical norms that might present the enterprise of enslavement in a negative light. And yet that enterprise is not entirely moralized, even by the Persians themselves. Xerxes vows that the guilty and the innocent will alike bear the yoke of slavery at 7-8 Gamma. And Mardonius turns Xerxes' ethical justification for the invasion into a mere a fortiori argument that blurs the distinction between provoked and unprovoked aggression. At 7.9.2, he says, it would be strange if the Persians are prepared to enslave peoples who've done nothing wrong, no wrong to them, and yet they refrain from retaliating against the Greeks who have harmed them or wronged them. With these statements, the slavery of the Persian subjects emerges as a matter of might rather than right, something that violates the claim to honor of those who lose their freedom. Slavery dishonors, but real and metaphorical slaves can also participate in reciprocal relations of mutual honor with their masters, even if the asymmetry of the relationship and its ultimate basis in power and violence remain to the fore. What the king demands from his subjects and what he represents as having been violated by the Greeks is what Stephen Darwall calls recognition respect. So what the king wants is respect for his status as such. This is the status that he refers to as this time. This is the time that he assumed when he entered upon the office of king or on the role of king. This kind of respect, as Darwall writes, consists in giving appropriate consideration or recognition to some feature of its object in deliberating about what to do. So this is something that you have to take account of in deciding how you are going to deal with this other person. In the king's case, this has implications about his performance as king. Sorry, in the king's case, this has no implications about his performance as king. You have to show recognition, respect for a king just because he's a king. But it does imply a claim on the king's part. And it does imply a corresponding obligation on the part of the other party. The king's genuinely or allegedly justified retaliation is a move that's designed to coerce recognition respect. You didn't respect his status. He will now show you that his status cannot be disrespected. In seeking, on the other hand, to enhance his esteem as a king, so to be seen as a worthy successor, to outdo his predecessors, to show himself as a real man and all these things, the king is focusing on a different kind of respect. This is the kind of respect that the king himself shows towards his loyal retainers and his devoted subjects. This is what Darwall calls appraisal respect. So the kind of respect that you have for an individual's excellencies. So Darwall writes that one may have appraisal respect for someone without having any particular conception of just what behavior from oneself would be required or appropriate by that person's having the features meriting such respect. But in fact, manifestations of time as appraisal respect in Greek sources regularly suggest that that qualification is not required. One of the main areas of overlap in Greek context between recognition respect and appraisal respect is that agents typically feel that their excellences demand respect and that withholding such respect is a violation of a claim. This is precisely the argument of Achilles in Iliad 1, which is both about appraisal respect and about recognition respect. And so a slave in a household, or a person subject regarded more or less metaphorically as the slave of the king, may not receive only the master or the king's appraisal respect, but may also feel that their merits, what is regularly called arete, or being a good man, deserve such respect. But crucially, slaves or subjects conceived of as slaves may also command recognition respect. And they do this, first of all, because the role or office conferred by the master or king as a mark of appraisal respect also constitutes a factor to which other people need to give appropriate consideration or recognition in deliberating about what to do. But it's also the case, by virtue of the fact that to be a benefactor is in itself to have a claim to reciprocal respect. The king may make someone his friend as an expression of appraisal respect. This person has done good things, this person is excellent, but the continuation of the relationship presupposes a degree of recognition respect. Your friends, your philoi, are not simply people that you evaluate positively with no particular conception of just what behavior from oneself would be required or appropriate. The status of friend in itself demands respect in return for the respect that friends pay us. And as Vlasopoulos in particular has shown with numerous examples, this is a feature of actual slavery too. Herodotus has mapped that feature of real-life literal slavery, of the source domain of slavery, onto the target domain of the king's relations with his subjects and benefactors. The presentation of the Persian project as one of enslaving their subject nations and of the relationship between the king and the subject as master and slave, therefore follows the ways in which honor is implicated in actual master-slave relationships. To enslave someone is to deny them the recognition respect to which free individuals are entitled. But performance of the duties of a slave not only creates extensive opportunities for appraisal respect, for being a good slave, it also leaves room for the creation of roles that attract recognition respect, as well as for the formation of reciprocal relationships that involve mutual exchange of recognition respect. And all of this is completely compatible with the ideas, first, that loss of freedom entails a catastrophic loss or diminution of a person's claim to recognition respect, and secondly, with the idea that slavery as a status entails no claim to recognition respect as such. Aristotle may be wrong about much else with regard to master-slave relations, but he's definitely onto something when he says, in number 19 here on the handout, that you can be the friend of a slave insofar as the slave is a human being, but not insofar as the slave is a slave. It's not that the honor that friends accord each other accrues to the status of human being as such. It accrues rather to the status of friend. But the point is that the honor that you might accord a slave doesn't accrue to the status of slave as such. But there are other grounds on which human beings who are in fact slaves can nonetheless obtain honor. The fact that people who fill the role of slave have claims to honor on the grounds of services rendered, benefits conferred, and the expectations generated by iterated reciprocity means that denial of these claims would constitute an illegitimate violation. One way of describing that might be hubris. And this wouldn't entail any implication that this hubris might be constituted by an assault on some form of honor that slaves possess insofar as they're slaves. No doubt as well, any such designation of such an act as hubris would focus to a large extent on the disposition of the hubristic agent, as well as on the lack of deference towards the victim. But the fact that even slaves can have claims to recognition respect, not insofar as they're slaves, but grounded in the obligations generated by concrete relationships and interactions, means the description of an action as hubris against a slave need not focus only on the honor of the agent, only on the honor of the hubristes. So there's a way here, I think, to bring what Mirko Canevaro has recently published on the subject of hubris and slavery into a closer relationship with what Nick Fisher has argued in the past. There is some sense there of honor which can be violated in an act of hubris against the slave. The rhetoric of slavery in Herodotus serves two purposes. It characterizes the king's relations with his subjects, and it characterizes the project of imposing that status upon hitherto free, mainly Greek peoples. In both these spheres, domestic as well as foreign policy, there are norms of reciprocity that the king, at least to some degree, recognizes. But also in both spheres, there are episodes that highlight the extent to which the king feels himself, in pragmatic terms, comparatively unconstrained by the obligations of recognition respect. The hubris that this entails in Persian policy towards the Greeks, especially with regard to Xerxes' invasion, is of course extensively highlighted in Herodotus, number 21 on the handout. For representatives of Greek polis, as Herodotus presents it, freedom isn't just a fact, it's a right, a status to which they have a legitimate title. They have a claim to this form of recognition respect. Free citizens of independent Greek polis resist Xerxes' denial of that claim to recognition respect. But they also castigate that denial as normatively unwarranted. They say it's unjust. The success of their resistance, in a sense, validates their claim. But this isn't just a matter of the pragmatics of conflict. Part of the Greek success, Herodotus suggests, derives from the legitimacy of their claim to respect. They win because they're in the right. The claim is vindicated, as several people have recently emphasized. This is number 22 on the handout. So the claim is vindicated, as many of us have emphasized, Catherine Clark, Kotso, Smolin, myself, Paolo Ceccarelli, and so on. Vindicated through the operation of the self-correcting mechanisms of a moralized universe, as well as by the interventions of gods, heroes, and humans in upholding this universal order. So I've given you lots of examples there in which you might say the environment itself seems to be ranged on the side of the Greeks and ranged against the Persians. The mechanisms involved here are, at least in a general sense, interestingly law-like. So there is this universal normative order, and Herodotus is confident in the maintenance of this universal order. But the order also has to be maintained by the actions of human individuals, and the actions of divine individuals too, in punishing transgressions. So you've got the rules, and the rules apply, and the idea is that the rules will eventually assert themselves, but human beings don't just leave it at that. They intervene, and they act, and they punish transgressions. Xerxes' failure to accord free polis the recognition respect that they deserve, his attempt to enslave them, isn't just negatively characterized as hubris. The hubris is also punished. So much for the attempt to enslave free nations. What about Xerxes' attempt or his practice of treating his subjects as slaves? There, I think the narrative of hubris and the comeuppance of hubris isn't quite so easy to construct or quite so salient in Herodotus's presentation. And yet the excessiveness of Xerxes' attachment to his own time is as prominent in his relations with his existing subjects as it is in his relations with the Greeks. His treatment of Pythias is one example, but we shouldn't forget that the closing pages of the histories in Book 9, chapters 108 to 113, feature a very striking portrait of a degenerate, power-crazed royal household driven by sexual intrigue, petty rivalries, and insane outbursts of anger. In warning against forms of thinking big that can also be described as hubris, which is these passages in number 21 on the handout, especially 21a here. So in these passages, warning against thinking big or hubris, Artabanus concentrates on the subjective, dispositional aspects of Xerxes' motivation. So not about what Xerxes is doing to other people, but what Xerxes is doing to himself. The dangers to Xerxes and the Persians of thinking big, being hubristic to this extent. And of course, the histories conclude with a warning attributed to Cyrus the Great. This is number 23 on the handout. So they conclude with a warning to the effect that the growth of wealth and power inevitably leads to decadence, decline, and becoming the slaves of others. The condition of servitude to a ruler or conqueror and the power that imposes that condition are historically contingent. They're not fixed forever. The growth of power in itself carries risks to the powerful. One of its symptoms is a tendency to overlook the fact that even the powerful are vulnerable and fallible. The powerful tend, above all, to concentrate more on their own claims to respect than on the claims of other people. In mapping the relationship of master and slave onto his portrayals of ruler and subject, Herodotus reminds us that other people have claims even in the most asymmetrical of human relationships. That's it. Thanks very much.
For this thoughtful and thought-provoking talk. Sure there are questions. Let me just ask a general one, if I may. What we've done here, what you've done here, is discuss the issues of time, honor, rhetoric, and slavery in Herodotus, using Herodotus as a reflection of reality. In other words, this is you're saying this represents codes and concepts of honor in reality rather than what Herodotus is. I mean, would someone else have presented it differently?
Yes, to an extent, yeah. So what I'm saying essentially is that this metaphor of master-slave relations is pervasive of the relation between the Persian ruler and his subjects, and of the relation between the Persians and non-Persians. And it mirrors not only the asymmetry of power there, but also certain other features of the relationship between master-slave, including the possibility of reciprocity of honor.
Okay, so we're not taking much distance from Herodotus then?
Well, I think we could. I think what's going on here is that Herodotus is reflecting features of actual master-slave relationships as they might sometimes be in Greek households.
Okay, thank you. Are there other questions? Maybe it'd be better if you came up and use the microphone. Would you like to ask or comment? David? Oh, we have a microphone. Oh, good. We have one in microphone.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Good. I think we wanted to take on the idea of that a king's subjects, the civilization of king's subjects to slaves, and that they recognize the king automatically makes you a slave. I want to mention the conflict that's going on in America now for a couple of years over the national anthem. The third verse of the Star Spangled Banner reads, no refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight and the gloom of the grave. The hireling there is surely the Hessian soldiers who served in King George's army, or the slaves. And
I'm sorry, I'm not getting all of this at this end. Could somebody possibly relay the point?
excuse me?
I'm not getting everything, so the microphone's cutting in and out on Zoom.
Just a minute, we're gonna get a better purchase on this. It's not a question, it's a comment.
Okay.
There's been a running argument going on in America for 4 or 5 years. The third verse of the national anthem includes the lines, "No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight and the gloom of the grave." Well, the hirelings are surely King George's Hessian soldiers.
Right. Yep.
Who are the slaves? Some 5 years ago, one football player refused to stand for the national anthem because of the presumption that the slaves he was speaking of were those slaves to whom the British in the War of 1812 had promised freedom if they would fight for the. They said, how can I, as a descendant of those slaves, give respect to this song? To which many people answered, as far as the Americans were considered, all the Britons were slaves because they had a king. And this is exactly the argument that we have here between Herodotus and the Persians, and the argument is still going on in America.
Yeah, I mean, that's the argument of both the Spartan witnesses in those passages. It's the argument of Demaratus and the argument of the two Spartans who respond to Hydarnes, exactly that. It's interesting that you mention that particular period. I mean, I have an interest, like all Scotsmen, in the poetry of Robert Burns, who's famous for his sentiments that the rank is but the guinea stamp, a man is a man for all that, and yet whose poems and songs are utterly permeated by the metaphor of slavery for the absence of political rights. So, you know, in support of the French Revolution and all that kind of stuff. And there is something to be explored there about the tension between that rhetoric, especially its use in service of the argument of the brotherhood of man and the rights of man and so on, and its apparent imperviousness to the existence of actual slavery, to the extent that Burns, in spite of his advocacy of equality and freedom, until his poems became successful, was preparing to travel to Jamaica to become an overseer on a slave plantation. So, I mean, the rhetoric of slavery in those contexts is interesting because although it's not necessarily being applied to actual slaves in conditions of actual slavery, it's nonetheless accepting that slavery is an entirely unacceptable condition.
The other thing that comes to regard to Jonathan's question about whether this is to Herodotus is the story in Plutarch's sayings of the Lacedaemonians, when he mentions the Spartan woman who was taken captive and was asked, what do you know how to do? And her answer was to be free.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I'll certainly take the opportunity to ask a question if I can. Should I stand up there?
Yeah.
You know, you beautifully delineated many of the different uses of the word time, sort of sub-meanings
and specific meanings. I mean, to what extent were the Greeks aware of the variations of meanings? Was it a unified concept to them? We use the word polysemy, but I'm wondering, just a general question that I have that I'd love to hear your opinion on. You know, there's certain cases where distinct, rigid uses of terms develop, and they really are distinct. And there's other cases where it seems like indeterminate, that a word can be used in surprising context because you don't have another word, and it's not exactly defined what the exact meaning of it is. What's that distinction?
No, I think that's exactly right, Gabriel. So it's interesting that, you know, if you're following usage, and of course, meaning is usage, it's always contextual. It's about how terms are used in particular contexts, and terms do take on particular connotations from different contexts, and different patterns of usage show that clearly different senses exist, not just for us as investigators in etic terms, but also in emic terms for the users of language too. One of the interesting things is that although I think it is actually quite clear that there are all these different senses of time, when people are asked for definitions, just as when anthropologists ask people for definitions nowadays, they tend to get only the most stereotypical, prototypical response. So, for example, when Aristotle defines time, he says it's the reward for euergesia, for benefaction. And he then enumerates some things that time might consist in, just as, in fact, Sarpedon does in Book 12 of the Iliad. So it might consist in grants of, you know, dinner, that kind of thing. It might be encomia, it might be inscriptions, it might be statues, all that kind of stuff. So he clearly there, he's talking about appraisal respect. So he's talking about what you get if you are perceived as excellent. And when he talks about the claims of time to be a good in itself in Book 1 of the Ethics, he says, well, time isn't the final good because we want time in order to reassure ourselves that we are excellent. So we want time to reassure ourselves that we are good, and therefore being good is what we want, and time is a kind of a step before that. But again, that's appraisal respect of excellence. And yet, if you look at his discussion of, on the one hand, anger in the second book of the Rhetoric, where anger is about responding to atimia or olegoria, it's clear there that time has to be not appraisal respect, but recognition respect. So it's when people don't accord you the recognition that you believe you deserve, the recognition to which you believe you have a claim, that you get angry. So, I mean, he uses this this term me prosecontos of the insult, the oligorein in that context. So this is a sense that you're being illegitimately treated, which is a sense that the other person should, as Darwell puts it, have factored your status into their deliberations about what to do. So they've denied a claim. So the essential point that Darwell makes about the difference between appraisal respect and recognition respect is that with the one, appraisal respect, you don't have the claim, but with recognition respect, you do. Aristotle, when he explicitly defines time, defines it in terms of appraisal respect, but he clearly needs to recognize recognition respect too, otherwise his account of anger doesn't work. And if you think of many of the instances of time in the Politics of Aristotle too, time is regularly used there as a synonym of arche, a synonym of office. So timai are the offices of the Athenian state, for example. And those are not instances of appraisal respect. Those are positions that demand the respect of one's fellow citizens. So there you've got time as a role which commands recognition respect. So the patterns of usage show that different senses definitely do exist. But I agree also that in some cases, it's very difficult to say that any one of these several things is exclusively in play. It's very often the case that more than one of those things may be at least connotatively present.
Yeah. Thank you very much. If there are no other questions or comments, you left us enriched. There's just an illuminating, learning, and endlessly interesting talk about topics that interest many fields in our vast field of classics. We're very, very, very grateful that you persisted despite all the difficulties and appeared even through although digitally, it was really, I think it worked. And so thank you very, very much for the effort, for the honor.
Thank you very much.
And next year the Classic Society's International Conference will be in Jerusalem. So borrowing a phrase from our Passover singer, next year in Jerusalem. Thank you very much.
Let's hope so. So thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for listening. And I'm very sorry I couldn't be with you, but I hope to join you in person another time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.